Rain hammered the earth as Cale ran, his bare feet tearing on broken stone, his breath ripping out of his throat in short, panicked gasps. Behind him, torches bounced through the dark trees like hungry eyes. He could hear the shouts of the men Lord Callum Ashford had sent after him, their voices sharp with anger, closing in with every heartbeat. Cale had been given only one choice in his life, and he had just broken it. He was supposed to be bonded to a man who saw him as property, not a person, and rather than stand at that altar, he had run into the night with nothing but the clothes on his back. The forest gave way to open, ruined land, and what Cale saw stopped him cold. The earth had been torn apart by battle, trenches gouged the ground, and the smell of smoke and blood hung heavy in the wet air. Bodies of soldiers lay scattered, and past them, half buried in mud, was something enormous. At first Cale thought it was a hill, or a fallen building, but as he crept closer, lightning split the sky and showed him the truth. It was a beast, larger than any horse or ox he had ever seen, shaped like a wolf but built like a mountain, with fur matted black from rain and blood. Its side had been torn open by some weapon, a wound wide enough for a grown man to crawl inside. The shouts behind him grew louder. Cale did not have time to feel fear of the creature when a different fear was already breathing down his neck. He made a choice in half a second, the kind of choice made only by someone who has run out of better options. He scrambled toward the fallen beast and pressed his hand against its cooling flank. It did not move. It did not breathe, not that he could tell. He told himself it was dead, a casualty of whatever battle had been fought here, and with that thought giving him just enough courage, he pulled himself into the wound in its side and disappeared into the dark, warm cavity of its body. Outside he heard boots splash through the mud, voices calling his name, cursing him, promising punishment. Cale pressed himself deeper into the strange shelter, surrounded by a smell that was not quite blood, and not quite anything he recognized, something wild and ancient. He held his breath until his lungs burned. The voices passed close, so close he could hear the men complaining about the rain, about the size of the dead beast nearby, about how the king's forces must have lost this ground badly. Then the voices faded, moving on toward the tree line, chasing shadows that were not him. Cale did not move for a long time. When he finally dared to breathe normally again, he realized how exhausted he truly was. His legs ached from running, his hands were scraped raw, and the adrenaline that had carried him this far was draining out of him like water through cracked stone. He curled into the space inside the beast's ribs, telling himself it was only for a few hours, just until the search parties gave up and returned to the estate empty-handed. The storm did not let up. Rain drummed against the creature's hide like 1,000 fingers tapping, and somewhere in that steady rhythm, Cale's exhaustion won over his fear. He fell into a sleep so deep it felt more like drowning, and when he woke, gray light was seeping through the wound above him. Morning had come, but he did not dare leave yet. He could still hear distant voices, farmers or soldiers moving across the battlefield to collect the dead, and every one of them was a reason to stay hidden a little longer. He told himself he would leave once it was safe, but safe never seemed to come. By midday he was thirsty enough that he crawled partway out to catch rainwater pooling in the folds of the beast's fur, careful to stay low, using the massive body as cover from anyone who might glance in his direction. He found a few strips of dried meat in a fallen soldier's pack nearby, close enough to reach without fully exposing himself, and he ate it without pride, without hesitation, because hunger does not care about dignity. By the second day, Cale had built a strange, quiet relationship with his hiding place. He no longer feared that the beast might wake and crush him, because surely something torn open like this, something so still and cold, was long past waking. He began to talk to it in a low voice, not because he expected an answer, but because the silence around him was unbearable otherwise. He told it about Lord Ashford, about the way the man had looked at him like a prize to be claimed, rather than a person to be loved. He told it about his mother, who had died when he was young, and about the promise he had made to himself, that he would not spend his life belonging to someone who did not see him as more than his status as an omega. He noticed, somewhere in the haze of his own exhaustion, that the great chest beneath him seemed to rise and fall in the faintest way, so slow and so slight, that he convinced himself it was only his imagination, or the wind-moving fur that had dried stiff with blood. He did not let himself consider the alternative. To consider the alternative would mean facing a fear far greater than Lord Ashford's men, and Cale did not have room in his heart for another fear just yet. On the second night, thunder rolled across the battlefield again, though the rain had eased to a soft drizzle. Cale lay curled against warmth that should not have existed in a dead thing. Warmth, he told himself, was only his own body heat trapped in a small space. He dreamed of running, always running, through forests and fields and grand hallways that turned into mud the moment he tried to escape them. He woke twice in a panic, certain the search parties had found him, only to find silence and darkness waiting instead. By the third day, hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing and insistent. Cale knew he could not stay forever. He had begun to plan his next move, thinking of the free territories beyond the mountains, where bonding laws did not bind Omegas the way they did in Ashford's lands, where a person might build a life on their own choices, rather than someone else's expectations. He decided that as soon as night fell again, he would leave the shelter of the fallen beast and begin the long walk toward the mountains, whatever dangers waited along the way. He did not know that his choice to stay one more night would change everything. As the third night deepened, and Cale prepared himself mentally for the journey ahead, he noticed something he had not noticed before. The warmth beneath him seemed stronger, more present, no longer something he could dismiss as imagination. He pressed his palm flat against the great expanse of fur and felt, unmistakably, a slow and powerful thrum, like the beat of a massive heart working to hold itself together. His breath caught in his throat. He told himself it could not be. Dead things did not have heartbeats. Dead things did not grow warmer as the hours passed. Cale sat frozen in the dark, his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed impossible. Perhaps it was some trick of the storm, some strange echo of his own pulse magnified by the tight space around him. Perhaps grief and exhaustion were finally breaking his mind after everything he had endured these past 3 days. But even as he tried to talk himself out of what his own hands were telling him, a low sound rumbled through the body around him, deep and resonant, the unmistakable sound of breath being drawn into enormous lungs. The beast was alive. Cale's whole body went rigid with terror. He was inside it. He was inside a living creature large enough to swallow him whole, a creature that had been lying so still for 3 days that he had convinced himself it was nothing more than a carcass, a shelter, a stroke of desperate luck. Now that luck felt like the worst mistake of his life. He tried to move, to pull himself free of the wound before the creature fully woke, but his limbs had gone weak with fear, and the space around him seemed to be tightening, muscles shifting beneath skin that was very much alive. Outside, the storm had passed entirely, leaving behind a strange, heavy silence, the kind of silence that comes just before something enormous happens. Cale pressed his hand against the wall of muscle and fur surrounding him, and felt it shudder. Felt the whole massive body begin to stir from whatever deep and terrible sleep had held it still for 3 long days. He had spent 3 days hiding inside a war beast that belonged to someone, that had been fighting in a battle only days before, and he had no idea what would happen when it woke and found a stranger curled inside its wound. For the first time since he had run from Lord Ashford's estate, Cale understood that running from one danger might have led him directly into the arms of something far greater and far less predictable than anything he had left behind. He held perfectly still, hoping against hope that whatever was waking around him might settle back into stillness, might decide the movement he felt was only his imagination, the same way he had once decided its heartbeat was only his own. But creatures of that size did not wake halfway. Cale felt the great ribs around him begin to expand with each breath, deeper and stronger than before, and beneath his palm, the slow heartbeat quickened into something urgent and alive. He thought of everything he had left behind in the last 3 days, the terror of the wedding he had fled, the mud and rain of his escape, the strange comfort he had found whispering secrets into what he believed was a lifeless shell. None of it had prepared him for the truth now pressing in on him from every side. Whatever slept around him was waking, and Cale, hungry, exhausted and utterly unprepared, was still inside it when it did. The last thing he registered before the world around him truly began to move was the sound of his own heartbeat matching the frantic rhythm of the one beneath his hand. 2 pulses suddenly racing together in the darkness, as though some invisible thread had already begun to draw them into a story neither of them had chosen, but neither would now be able to escape. Cale pressed his back against the inside of the wound, wishing he could disappear into the shadows entirely, wishing he had left one night sooner, wishing for anything other than what was about to happen. But wishes had never saved him before, and they would not save him now. The beast was waking, and Cale had no choice left but to face whatever came next. Somewhere deep beneath the fear gripping his chest, a smaller, quieter thought flickered to life. In 3 days of whispered confessions and desperate hiding, he had shared more honesty with this silent creature than he ever had with another living soul. He wondered, with a strange and terrible clarity, whether it had somehow heard every word. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, as the great body finally stirred fully awake, and Cale braced himself, eyes wide in the darkness, for whatever truth was about to unfold around him. The great body convulsed once, twice, and then began to fold in on itself in a way that made Cale's stomach lurch with dizziness. Bone and muscle shifted beneath him, the enormous ribs he had hidden behind for 3 days drawing inward, shrinking, reshaping into something entirely different. Fur receded into skin. The wound that had sheltered him closed as though it were being stitched by invisible hands, and Cale found himself no longer curled inside a cavity of muscle, but tumbling out onto cold, wet earth beside a man. He scrambled backward on his hands, heart slamming against his ribs, and stared at the figure now lying where the beast had been. The man was broad-shouldered and powerfully built, his bare skin marked with old scars and one still healing wound across his side, precisely where Cale had been hiding only moments before. His hair was dark and damp, plastered against a face that, even slack with exhaustion, carried an unmistakable air of authority. When his eyes opened, they were a deep, molten gold, and they fixed on Cale with an intensity that pinned him in place more effectively than any chains could have. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Cale's mind raced through explanations, apologies, excuses, anything that might soften whatever punishment was surely coming for a stranger who had spent 3 days hidden inside a wounded man's transformed body without permission. But before he could force words out of his tightening throat, the man pushed himself upright, wincing at the movement, and studied Cale with open curiosity, rather than the anger Cale had braced for. "You smell like fear," the man said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "And rain. And something else, something familiar." Cale did not know how to respond to that. He pressed himself further back, putting distance between them, though there was truly nowhere to run in the open, ruined field around them. "I am sorry," he managed to say, the words tumbling out too fast. "I thought you were dead. I did not know. I would never have hidden there if I had known you were alive." The man's brow furrowed, not in anger, but in something closer to confusion, as though he were piecing together fragments of memory that did not yet form a whole picture. He looked down at his own hands, flexing his fingers slowly, testing muscles that had not moved under his own control for 3 full days. 3 days, he repeated, almost to himself. "You said 3 days." Cale nodded, unable to find his voice again. The man's gaze sharpened, moving over Cale properly for the first time, taking in his torn clothes, his exhaustion, the way he held himself like someone who had spent his whole life flinching before a blow could land. Something shifted in his expression, softening slightly, though the authority in his bearing never wavered. "You hid inside me," he said slowly, as though testing the strangeness of the sentence. "And you talked to me. I remember voices. I remember warmth. I thought I was dreaming." Cale's face burned with humiliation at the thought that his whispered confessions, meant only for what he believed was a lifeless shell, had somehow reached the man now sitting before him. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but the sound of approaching footsteps cut him off. Several soldiers were making their way across the ruined field, their armor catching the pale morning light, and the moment they spotted the man beside Cale, their reaction told him everything he needed to know about who he had truly been hiding inside. The soldiers dropped to one knee in the mud without hesitation, their voices rising in a chorus of relief and disbelief. "Your Majesty," one of them said, breathless, "we thought you had fallen. We searched for 3 days and found nothing but the wreckage. We feared the worst." Cale's blood ran cold. "Your Majesty." The words echoed in his mind, refusing to make sense at first, and then making entirely too much sense all at once. The beast he had hidden inside, the creature he had spoken to as though it were nothing more than a convenient shelter, had been the war form of a king. Not just any king, but the Alpha King himself, ruler of lands Cale had only ever heard spoken of in fearful whispers by Lord Ashford's household staff. The king rose to his feet slowly, favoring the side where his wound had been, and waved off the soldiers' attempts to help him. His eyes flicked back to Cale, who remained frozen on the ground, unable to decide whether running would make things better or infinitely worse. "Bring him," the king said simply, nodding toward Cale, and something in his tone made it clear this was not a request open to argument. 2 of the soldiers moved toward Cale, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee, to disappear into the tree line and take his chances alone, rather than be dragged into whatever fate awaited him at the hands of a king he had unknowingly used as shelter. But exhaustion and hunger had drained the strength from his legs days ago, and before he could decide whether resistance was even possible, gentle but firm hands helped him upright. "I mean you no harm," the king said, watching Cale's fear with something that looked almost like regret. "But I will have answers. 3 days is a long time to hide inside a stranger, and longer still to keep secrets from the man who saved your life without meaning to." Cale's mind spun with the impossible turn his circumstances had taken. He had fled one danger only to stumble, quite literally, into the body of a king, and now that same king was insisting he come along. Not as a prisoner exactly, but not entirely free either. The soldiers formed a loose escort around them both as they began the long walk toward whatever camp lay beyond the ruined battlefield. And Cale found himself stealing glances at the man beside him, trying to reconcile the powerful, commanding figure now walking with a slight limp against the still, seemingly lifeless creature he had hidden inside for 3 desperate days. The king said little as they walked, though Cale caught him watching from the corner of his eye more than once, studying him the way one might study a puzzle with several missing pieces. When they finally crested a low hill and the war camp came into view, tents stretching across the valley below and banners bearing a wolf's head snapping in the wind, Cale understood with sudden, sinking clarity that there would be no simple explanation that made his 3 days of hiding sound anything less than strange. Soldiers throughout the camp stopped their tasks to stare as the king passed, murmurs rippling outward faster than any messenger could have carried the news. Cale kept his eyes down, uncomfortably aware of every gaze that flicked toward him, aware that whatever story was already forming in the minds of these soldiers would not be one that painted him kindly. He was an unbonded Omega, filthy and exhausted, walking beside a king who had been presumed dead only hours before, and no explanation he could offer would sound anything but impossible. They reached a large tent at the center of camp, and the king finally turned to face him fully once inside, dismissing the soldiers with a single gesture that emptied the space of everyone but the 2 of them. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a low bench near a modest fire someone had already lit. "You look like you have not eaten properly in days." Cale hesitated only a moment before his hunger won out over his caution, sinking onto the bench while the king settled across from him, still moving carefully around his healing wound. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the crackle of the fire filling the silence between them. Then the king leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes searching Cale's face with an intensity that made it difficult to look away. "Tell me your name," he said quietly, "and tell me why an Omega was running alone through a battlefield instead of somewhere safe." Cale swallowed hard, aware that whatever he said next would shape everything that followed. He had spent 3 days hiding from questions like this, and now, sitting across from the very king he had unknowingly sheltered inside, he understood there was nowhere left to hide the truth. "Cale," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Cale." The king studied him a moment longer, as though testing the name against something in his memory, then nodded once. "Draven," he said simply. "That is what my men call me when they are not busy kneeling in mud and shouting titles at me." The plain offering of a name, without the weight of crown or ceremony behind it, loosened something tight in Cale's chest. He found himself studying Draven's face properly for the first time, no longer through the haze of terror that had colored every moment since the beast first stirred. There was exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, and beneath the authority he carried so naturally, something almost weary, as though ruling had cost him more than most people ever guessed. "Now," Draven said, leaning back slightly, "tell me why you were running." Cale's hands twisted together in his lap. He had spent so long guarding this story, afraid of how it would be judged, that saying it aloud felt like peeling back a layer of skin he had grown to protect himself. "I was to be bonded," he began carefully, "to a lord who saw me only as property, Lord Callum Ashford. My family owed him a debt, and the bonding was arranged to settle it, as though I were nothing more than a payment." Draven's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened at the name. "Ashford," he repeated slowly. "I know that name. It has crossed paths with mine before, though not for reasons that speak well of him." Cale pressed on before his courage could fail him. "I ran on the night of the ceremony. I had nothing planned, no destination, only the certainty that I could not stand at that altar and pretend the rest of my life belonged to someone who saw me as an object to be claimed, rather than a person with choices of my own. I ran until I found the battlefield, and when I saw your fallen body, I thought only of shelter. I did not know what I was hiding inside. I swear to you, I meant no disrespect." Draven was quiet for a long moment, the firelight flickering across his features, while he considered everything Cale had said. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened, though the weight of command never fully left it. "You owe me no apology for surviving," he said. "Whatever instinct led you to that shelter kept you alive through 3 nights in territory, crawling with enemy scouts and worse. That is not disrespect. That is resilience." Cale blinked, caught off guard by the response. He had braced himself for anger, for accusations of trespass or worse, and instead found something closer to understanding. Still, he could not shake the unease coiling in his stomach. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Will you send me back to Ashford's estate?" Something flickered across Draven's face, quick and sharp, gone before Cale could fully read it. "No," he said firmly. "You are not returning to a man who treats people as debts to be collected. Not while you are under my protection." The words settled over Cale like an unexpected weight, equal parts relief and confusion. He did not understand why a king, a stranger he had only just met under the strangest circumstances imaginable, would extend protection so readily to someone with nothing to offer in return. But before he could voice that confusion, the tent flap parted, and a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard stepped inside, relief written plainly across his weathered features. "Your Majesty," the man said, bowing his head briefly. "Word has already spread through camp. I came the moment I heard you were found alive." Draven gestured for the man to enter fully. "Cale, this is General Edric. He has served beside me since before I took the crown, and he will tell you honestly that I am usually far less patient than I have been this morning." Edric's sharp eyes moved to Cale, assessing him with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent years reading soldiers and threats alike. His gaze lingered on Cale's torn clothing, his exhausted posture, and something in his expression softened slightly, though caution remained. "And who is this?" he asked, careful and measured. "The one who kept me alive these past 3 days," Draven answered before Cale could speak, though not in the way either of us expected. Edric's eyebrows lifted, but he said nothing further on the matter, clearly trusting his king's judgment even when the details remained mysterious. Instead, he turned back to Draven with the efficiency of a man used to managing crises. "The ambush that felled you was no accident, Your Majesty. We have reason to believe the enemy knew exactly where our forces would be, and exactly when to strike. Someone within our own ranks may have shared that information." Draven's expression darkened, the weariness in his eyes replaced by something colder and far more calculating. Cale watched the shift happen, watched the king who had spoken to him with quiet patience only moments before, transform into someone clearly capable of commanding armies and rooting out betrayal. It was a reminder, sharp and sudden, of exactly how far above his own circumstances this man truly stood. "Gather what evidence you can," Draven instructed Edric, quietly. "I do not want whoever orchestrated this to know that I survived, not yet. Let them believe their plan succeeded for a while longer. It may draw them into a mistake." Edric nodded, already turning toward the tent flap, though he paused once more to glance at Cale. "And him?" he asked carefully. "What do we tell the camp regarding his presence?" Draven considered this for a moment, his gaze flicking to Cale with something unreadable in his expression. "He remains under my protection," he said finally. "No explanations beyond that are necessary for now." Once Edric had gone, silence settled over the tent again, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Cale studied his own hands, unable to shake the feeling that he had stumbled into something far larger than a simple rescue, something tangled with politics and betrayal, that had nothing to do with him and yet somehow already did. "You believe someone tried to have you killed," he said quietly, more statement than question. Draven's jaw tightened. "I believe someone close to my court arranged that ambush, hoping I would not survive it. And if they learn that I have, and that I returned with a companion no one can explain, they may come looking for answers neither of us wants to give." Cale's stomach twisted with new understanding. He had run from one danger only to land, quite literally, inside the center of another, one far more complicated than a cruel lord and a broken bonding contract. "Then perhaps I should leave," he said carefully, testing the words even as something in his chest resisted them. "Before my presence becomes a complication you cannot afford." Draven's gaze snapped up to meet his, sharp and immediate. "No," he said, the single word carrying more weight than Cale expected. "You will stay. If Ashford learns you fled and comes searching, my protection is the safest place you could possibly be. And if my enemies believe you know something you do not, sending you away only makes you a target with no shield to stand behind." Cale did not know how to respond to the certainty in Draven's voice, the way he had decided Cale's fate within seconds without a hint of doubt. It should have frightened him, this easy assumption of authority over his choices, and yet something about the way Draven said it, protective rather than possessive, made it difficult to feel anything but a strange, unfamiliar sense of safety. "You barely know me," Cale said quietly, half to himself. "I know enough," Draven answered, his voice softening again. "I know you spent 3 days whispering truths to what you believed was a corpse, rather than telling those same truths to a living soul who might judge you for them. That tells me more about a person than most conversations ever could." Heat rose in Cale's face at the reminder that his most private confessions had not disappeared into silence after all, but had somehow reached the man now watching him with quiet, careful attention. He opened his mouth to respond, though he was not entirely certain what he intended to say, when the sound of raised voices outside the tent cut through the moment, sharp and urgent, carrying words that made both men go still. Riders approaching from the eastern road, a voice called out. "They carry Ashford's banner, Your Majesty." Cale's blood ran cold for the second time that day, understanding immediately that whatever fragile safety he had just begun to feel was about to be tested far sooner than he had hoped. Draven rose to his feet immediately, all traces of the quiet, patient man Cale had spoken with only moments before gone, replaced by someone hardened and alert. He gestured for Cale to remain seated, then strode toward the tent entrance, pausing only long enough to speak over his shoulder. "Stay here," he said firmly. "Whatever happens outside, you do not show yourself until I say otherwise." Cale's heart pounded as he listened to the commotion growing outside the tent. The sound of horses and raised voices. The clatter of armor as soldiers moved to positions along the camp's perimeter. He crept closer to the tent flap, unable to resist the urge to look, and peered through a narrow gap at the scene unfolding beyond. 3 riders had arrived, their horses lathered from hard travel, and though none of them wore the face of Lord Ashford himself, Cale recognized the crest stitched into their cloaks immediately, the same crest that had hung over the estate he fled only days before. The lead rider, a thin man with sharp features and a voice that carried easily across the camp, addressed the soldiers blocking his path with obvious impatience. "We seek an Omega who fled our lord's household," the rider announced. "A young man named Cale, last seen fleeing toward the border. We have reason to believe he may have passed through this territory, and Lord Ashford demands his immediate return, as is his right under the bonding contract signed by the Omega's family." Cale's stomach dropped. He had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that Ashford would not simply let him go, that the debt owed by his family would not vanish simply because he ran far enough. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing himself reduced to a possession to be reclaimed, rather than a person who had made a choice, filled him with a fresh wave of the same helpless anger that had driven him to flee in the first place. Draven stepped forward then, and even from Cale's limited view through the tent flap, the effect of his presence on the assembled soldiers and the visiting riders was immediate and unmistakable. The lead rider's face paled as recognition dawned, and he dropped to one knee so quickly he nearly stumbled. "Your Majesty," the man stammered, "we believed, that is, word reached us, that you had fallen in battle." "Word was wrong," Draven said, his voice carrying an edge Cale had not heard from him before, cold and commanding, in a way that left no room for argument. "And you would do well to remember that spreading rumors of a king's death, even second-hand, is not something taken lightly in my court." The rider bowed his head lower, clearly scrambling to recover his composure. "Of course, Your Majesty. Forgive the error. We came only on Lord Ashford's business, seeking a runaway Omega who broke a lawful bonding contract. If you have seen or sheltered such a person, we ask that you return him to his rightful obligations." Cale held his breath, waiting for Draven's answer, uncertain whether the king would protect a stranger's secret at the cost of tension, with a lord who clearly held some standing in the region. When Draven finally spoke, his voice carried a finality that settled over the camp like a physical weight. "I have seen no such person," Draven said evenly. "And even if I had, I would remind Lord Ashford that bonding contracts signed to settle debts, particularly those involving an Omega who had no voice in the arrangement, are not always as lawful as he might wish them to be. I suggest he consider that carefully before sending riders into my territory demanding compliance." The lead rider's face flickered with something between confusion and alarm, clearly unprepared for a king to question the legitimacy of a contract rather than simply confirming or denying a runaway's presence. He opened his mouth as though to argue further, then seemed to think better of it, bowing once more instead. "We will relay your words to our lord, Your Majesty." "See that you do," Draven replied, and something in his tone made it clear the conversation was over. The riders departed not long after, their horses kicking up dust as they turned back toward the eastern road, and Cale finally allowed himself to breathe again, sinking back onto the bench inside the tent as the adrenaline of the encounter slowly drained from his body. When Draven returned moments later, his expression had softened only slightly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "They will not stop searching," Draven said, settling back across from Cale. "Men like Ashford rarely accept refusal gracefully, especially when their pride is wounded alongside their profits." Cale's hands had begun to tremble, the reality of how close danger had come settling into his bones. "Why did you protect me?" he asked quietly. "You barely know me, and now you have made an enemy of a lord for my sake." Draven considered the question for a long moment before answering, his golden eyes thoughtful. "Ashford was already no friend of mine," he said. "His trade dealings have crossed lines before, lines that matter more to the safety of my kingdom than his comfort ever will. Protecting you from an unjust contract costs me little, and it tells me something important about the kind of ruler I wish to be. The answer should have satisfied Cale, and in some measure it did, but a smaller, quieter part of him wondered whether there was more to Draven's protectiveness than simple principle. He did not voice that thought, uncertain what to make of it himself, and instead let the silence between them stretch until Draven spoke again. "You should rest properly," Draven said, rising to his feet with the careful movements of a man still favoring a healing wound. "There is a tent nearby that has been prepared for you, and I will have food brought to you shortly. Tomorrow, we will discuss what comes next." Cale nodded, grateful for the reprieve, though sleep did not come easily once he was finally settled into the small tent Draven's soldiers had prepared for him. His mind kept circling back to the strange turns his life had taken in the span of a single week, from a forced bonding to a desperate escape, from 3 days hidden inside a fallen beast to standing, quite literally, in the shadow of a king's protection. Elsewhere in the camp, unnoticed by either Cale or Draven, a figure moved quietly between the tents under cover of darkness, pausing only long enough to press a folded piece of parchment into the hand of a waiting messenger before melting back into the shadows. The messenger mounted a horse tethered at the camp's edge and rode off into the night, carrying word to someone far away that the king had survived his supposed death, and that an unexpected complication now traveled at his side. The figure who had sent that message lingered a moment longer near the edge of camp, watching the small tent where Cale now slept with an expression that revealed nothing of the calculations turning behind their eyes. Whatever plans had been set in motion by the ambush that nearly killed the king, they were far from finished, and the arrival of an unknown Omega, one who now stood under the king's direct protection, had introduced a variable that would need to be accounted for, one way or another. Morning arrived cold and clear, sunlight cutting through the canvas of Cale's tent and pulling him from a restless sleep. He found a simple meal waiting just inside the entrance, along with fresh clothing that fit reasonably well despite clearly being borrowed from someone closer to Draven's build than his own. He dressed slowly, grateful for the small comfort of clean fabric against his skin, and stepped outside to find the camp already alive with activity, soldiers moving between tents with purpose, the sound of hammers striking metal ringing out from a makeshift forge nearby. Draven found him a short while later, looking more rested than the previous day, though the careful way he still favored his side suggested his healing was far from complete. "There is much to discuss," he said without preamble, gesturing for Cale to walk with him, "and I fear our situation has grown more complicated overnight." Cale's stomach tightened at the words, bracing himself for whatever news awaited, uncertain whether the strange safety he had begun to feel within Draven's protection would survive whatever complications the coming day intended to bring. They walked together through the camp, Draven's presence drawing quiet nods of respect from every soldier they passed, though Cale noticed more than a few curious glances directed his way as well. He kept his eyes forward, trying not to think too hard about how strange it must look, an unbonded Omega walking freely at the side of a king so soon after appearing from nowhere. General Edric found them near the edge of camp, his expression grim in a way that made Cale's unease sharpen further. "Your Majesty," he said, falling into step beside them, "we have confirmed what we suspected. The ambush that struck you was planned with information only a handful of people within your own court could have known. Troop movements, timing, even the exact location of your warform's last known position before the battle." Draven's jaw tightened. "Names," he said simply. Edric hesitated only briefly before answering. "Lord Silas Vance has been asking unusual questions since word of your survival spread this morning. He claims concern for your well-being, but his questions cut closer to strategy than sympathy ever would." Cale listened to the exchange with growing understanding, piecing together the shape of the danger Draven now faced. It was not simply a matter of enemies beyond the kingdom's borders, but something far more insidious, a betrayal wearing the face of a trusted advisor, hidden within the very walls meant to keep the king safe. "Watch him," Draven instructed Edric, quietly. "I want to know who he speaks with and what he asks before we move against him. If Silas is behind this, I want the full shape of his plan before I act, not just his name." Edric nodded and departed to see the order carried out, leaving Draven and Cale alone once more near the quiet edge of the camp, where the sounds of soldiers and horses faded into the rustle of wind through nearby trees. Draven turned to Cale then, his expression thoughtful in a way that made Cale brace himself for whatever request was coming. "I have a proposal," Draven said carefully, "and I want you to understand you are free to refuse it." Cale waited, saying nothing, letting the silence draw the rest of the explanation out of him. "If Silas or whoever stands behind him believes I am vulnerable, recovering from injury and distracted by an unexplained companion at my side, They may grow careless in ways that reveal their full plan. Draven continued. I would ask you to remain close to me, publicly, as someone under my protection and companionship, while we quietly gather proof of the betrayal. It would mean scrutiny, questions, perhaps even danger, though I would do everything in my power to keep you safe from the worst of it. Kale's mind raced through the implications of such an arrangement. It would mean stepping fully into the center of court politics he understood nothing about, becoming a visible piece on a board where the true players remained hidden in shadow. It would also mean staying near Draven, an idea that stirred something complicated in his chest, equal parts apprehension and a feeling he did not yet have the courage to name. Why me? Kale asked quietly. You could choose anyone from your own court to play such a role, someone who understands the dangers far better than I do. Draven's gaze softened slightly. Because I trust you already, more than I trust most who have served in my court for years. Whatever instinct led you to hide inside me during the worst moment of my life, it was not born of ambition or calculation. It was survival, honest and unguarded. That is rare enough to be valuable in a place as full of hidden motives as mine. The sincerity in his voice left little room for doubt, and Kale found himself nodding slowly before he had fully decided to agree. I will help, he said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded despite the uncertainty churning beneath it. But I do not know the customs of your court, or how to behave in a role I do not understand. You will learn, Draven said, something like relief flickering across his features, and I will not leave you to navigate it alone. Over the following days, Kale found himself drawn deeper into the rhythms of the war camp, and eventually, once Draven's healing allowed for travel, the journey toward the capital itself. He learned the careful etiquette expected of someone standing near a king, the subtle bows and greetings that shifted depending on rank and circumstance, the quiet art of listening more than speaking in rooms full of nobles whose true intentions rarely matched their words. Draven proved a patient teacher despite the demands constantly pulling at his attention, correcting Kale's missteps gently rather than harshly, and more than once, Kale caught him watching with an expression that seemed to hold more warmth than the arrangement between them strictly required. He told himself it was simply the natural result of spending so much time in close proximity, that whatever warmth passed between them was born of necessity rather than something deeper. But the nights were harder to explain away. More than once, unable to sleep, Kale found himself wandering toward whatever fire Draven sat beside, drawn by a comfort he did not fully understand, and more than once, Draven made space for him without comment, as though his presence there was simply expected rather than remarkable. It was during one such night, several days into their journey toward the capital, that Draven finally asked the question Kale had been quietly dreading since the moment he agreed to this arrangement. What will you do? He asked. Once Silas is dealt with and Ashford's claim on you is settled, where will you go? Kale stared into the fire, turning the question over in his mind. I do not know, he admitted honestly. I never planned further than escape. Freedom was the only goal I allowed myself to imagine. And now, Draven pressed gently, do you still wish only for distance, or has something changed? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them had spoken aloud directly. Kale's heart pounded as he considered how to answer honestly without revealing more than he was ready to admit, even to himself. I do not know that either, he finally said, his voice quieter than before. Everything I believed I wanted before feels less certain now. Draven did not push further, though something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what Kale meant, and was perhaps grappling with a similar uncertainty of his own. They sat together in silence for a while longer, the fire crackling softly between them, until exhaustion finally pulled Kale towards sleep, his mind still turning over questions he was not yet ready to answer. The following morning brought word that would sharpen the danger surrounding them both. A rider arrived from the capital, breathless with urgency, bearing news that Lord Ashford had grown impatient with Draven's refusal to surrender Kale, and had taken his grievance directly to the royal court, demanding a formal hearing to settle the matter of the broken bonding contract once and for all. Draven read the message twice, his expression darkening with each pass, before finally looking up to meet Kale's anxious gaze. It seems, he said grimly, that we will not have the luxury of resolving Silas's betrayal quietly before Ashford forces his own confrontation into the open. Kale's stomach twisted with dread at the thought of facing Ashford directly, of standing before a royal court and having his entire fate debated as though he were nothing more than a disputed piece of property. Whatever fragile safety he had built over the past days suddenly felt precarious again, threatened by a confrontation neither he nor Draven had chosen the timing for, but one that could no longer be avoided. The capital rose before them 2 days later, its towers pale against the morning sky, banners bearing the wolf's head crest snapping proudly from every wall, Cale had never seen anything like it, having spent his entire life confined to Ashford's modest estate and the surrounding countryside, and despite the anxiety twisting through his chest, he could not help but stare at the grandeur unfolding around him as their procession moved through the city gates. The palace itself felt like another world entirely. All polished stone and soaring ceilings, servants moving with practiced efficiency through hallways lined with tapestries, depicting battles fought generations before Cale was born. Draven walked these halls with the ease of someone who had known them his entire life, though Cale noticed the subtle way his shoulders tensed the moment they passed a group of nobles clustered near the entrance to the throne room, their whispered conversations falling silent as the king approached. Among them stood a tall man with silver threaded through his dark hair, his expression carefully composed into something resembling relief, though his eyes carried a calculation that made Cale's instincts prickle with unease before introductions were even made. "Your Majesty," the man said, bowing with practiced grace. "We feared the worst when word of the ambush reached us. It brings me great relief to see you return safely." "Lord Silas," Draven replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Your concern is noted." Cale watched the exchange carefully, remembering Edric's warning about the questions Silas had been asking since news of Draven's survival spread. Nothing in the man's demeanor betrayed guilt, his expression carefully arranged into polite warmth, but something about the way his gaze lingered on Cale, assessing and cool despite his pleasant smile, sent a chill down Cale's spine. "And who is this?" Silas asked, his voice light with practiced curiosity. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "This is Cale," Draven answered smoothly, before Cale could decide how to respond himself. "He has become a valued companion since my return from the border." Silas's smile did not waver, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, gone too quickly for Cale to fully read. "How fortunate," he said, "that you found companionship even amid such danger. I look forward to learning more about him, once matters of state allow for proper introductions." The exchange left Cale feeling as though he had narrowly avoided some invisible trap, though he could not articulate exactly what danger had passed. Once Silas had moved on, disappearing down a side corridor with two other nobles trailing in his wake, Draven's expression tightened with something between frustration and concern. "He suspects something," Draven murmured, low enough that only Cale could hear. "I do not yet know what, but he is watching more closely than I would like." They continued deeper into the palace, and over the following days, Cale found himself navigating an entirely new kind of danger, one measured not in swords or pursuit, but in careful words and unspoken implications. Nobles approached him with polite curiosity that felt more like interrogation, testing the edges of his story, searching for inconsistencies that might reveal weakness. Cale learned quickly to answer vaguely, deflecting deeper questions with practiced grace that Draven had taught him during their journey, though the constant scrutiny left him exhausted by the end of each day. Edric continued his quiet investigation into Silas's activities, and slowly, carefully, evidence began to accumulate. A servant loyal to Edric reported overhearing Silas speaking with a messenger about troop positions that matched almost exactly the information used in the ambush. Another found correspondence hidden within Silas's private study, coded but not skillfully enough to escape Edric's trained eye entirely. It was during this tense period of gathering evidence that Cale and Draven's relationship continued to deepen, in ways neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. Late evenings found them together often, sometimes discussing the mounting evidence against Silas, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence while Draven reviewed reports and Cale read from the palace's modest collection of books available to him. The easy familiarity between them grew steadily, until even the palace staff began to notice, exchanging knowing glances whenever Cale appeared at Draven's side during meals or council gatherings. One evening, as autumn winds began sweeping through the palace gardens, Draven found Cale sitting alone near a small fountain, watching the water catch the last light of sunset. He settled beside him without invitation, and for a while, neither of them spoke, content simply to share the quiet. "You have adapted well," Draven finally said, breaking the silence. "Better than I expected, given how little time you have had to learn the customs of a life you never asked to be part of." Cale considered the observation, surprised to realize it was true. "I did not expect to feel steady here," he admitted. "Everything about this place should terrify me. And yet somehow it does not entirely." Draven's gaze softened as he studied Cale's profile in the fading light. "Perhaps steadiness has less to do with the place," he said quietly, "and more to do with the company you keep within it." The words settled between them with a weight that neither seemed ready to fully address, though something in Draven's expression suggested he had meant them exactly as they sounded. Cale's heart quickened, uncertain how to respond to an implication he had begun to suspect but had not allowed himself to fully believe. Before either of them could venture further into the conversation, neither seemed brave enough to finish. Edric arrived at the garden's edge, his expression grave enough to pull both of them immediately back into the reality of their situation. "Your Majesty," he said, "we have found conclusive proof. Silas has been in contact with agents from beyond our northern border for months, feeding them information in exchange for promises of power once you were removed from the throne." Draven rose immediately, all softness gone from his expression, replaced by the sharp focus of a king facing betrayal from within his own court. "Show me," he said, and Cale rose as well, understanding without needing to be told that whatever peace they had found in the garden was about to be interrupted by a confrontation that had been building since the moment the ambush first struck. As they made their way back toward the palace, Cale's thoughts churned with uncertainty. The evidence against Silas would soon force a reckoning that could reshape the entire court, and somewhere beneath the layers of political danger, Ashford's demand for a formal hearing still loomed on the horizon, waiting to test whatever fragile safety Cale had built for himself within Draven's protection. He glanced sideways at Draven as they walked, noting the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he composed his expression into something unreadable, before facing whatever waited within the palace walls. Whatever came next, Cale realized with quiet certainty, he no longer wished to face it from a distance. Somewhere along their journey from the ruined battlefield to these gilded halls, his fate had become tangled with Draven's in ways too deep to simply walk away from, even if the road ahead grew far more dangerous than anything he had yet faced. Edric led them to a private council chamber where a small collection of documents lay spread across a heavy wooden table, gathered over weeks of careful, quiet investigation. Draven examined each piece methodically, his jaw tightening further with every letter, every coded message that confirmed what Edric had already told him. Silas Vance had been selling information to agents beyond the northern border for months, patient and careful, waiting for an opportunity that finally arrived in the form of a battlefield ambush meant to end Draven's reign permanently. "We have enough," Draven said finally, setting the last document down with controlled precision. "Bring him before the court tomorrow morning. I want this handled openly, so no one within these walls mistakes betrayal for something that can be hidden or forgiven quietly." Cale, standing quietly near the chamber's entrance, watched the transformation in Draven with a mixture of awe and unease. This was not the same man who had spoken gently to him beside quiet fires, but someone forged by years of ruling a kingdom that demanded strength even when weariness threatened to overwhelm him. It was a reminder, sharp and sobering, of exactly how much responsibility rested on Draven's shoulders. Responsibility that Cale, despite everything that had grown between them, could not fully share or lighten. The following morning, the throne room filled with nobles, summoned for what they believed was simply another routine council session. Cale stood near the edge of the gathered crowd, close enough to Draven's throne to feel the weight of curious glances directed his way, though his attention remained fixed on the doors through which Silas would soon enter, unaware of what awaited him. When Silas arrived, his expression carried its usual polished calm, though something flickered briefly in his eyes as he took in the unusually tense atmosphere of the chamber. The guards positioned more prominently than typical council gatherings required. "Your Majesty," he said, offering his customary bow. "You summoned me." "I did," Draven replied, his voice carrying easily across the silent chamber. "I have questions regarding correspondence discovered within your private study. Correspondence that details troop movements, matching precisely the information used to orchestrate the ambush that nearly claimed my life." The color drained from Silas's face, though he recovered quickly, forcing his expression back into something resembling confusion. "I do not understand, Your Majesty. Surely there has been some mistake." "There is no mistake," Draven said, gesturing for Edric to step forward with the gathered evidence. Edric read the documents aloud, methodical and unflinching, detailing dates, names, and precise descriptions of information exchanged for promises of power once Draven had been removed from the throne. With each revelation, murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles, shock and outrage building steadily as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Silas's composure finally cracked entirely as the weight of evidence mounted against him, his carefully maintained mask slipping to reveal something colder and more desperate underneath. "You do not understand the pressures of holding this kingdom together," he spat, his voice rising with barely contained fury. "You inherited a crown you never fought for, while men like me have spent decades ensuring stability, while you play at being a hero on distant battlefields." "Whatever grievances you believed justified betrayal," Draven replied evenly, "do not excuse the attempt to have me killed, nor the willingness to sell information that endangered every soldier who fought alongside me that day." Silas said nothing further as guards moved to restrain him, his expression settling into something bitter and resigned, as he was led from the chamber to await formal judgment. Once the doors had closed behind him, the tension in the room shifted, nobles exchanging uneasy glances as they processed the reality that betrayal had reached so close to the throne itself. Draven addressed the remaining council briefly, reassuring them that the matter would be handled with full transparency, and that appropriate measures would be taken to prevent similar breaches in the future. As the gathering slowly dispersed, Cale remained near the edge of the chamber, watching Draven carefully as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade from his expression, replaced by quiet exhaustion. "You did well," Cale offered softly once most of the nobles had departed, and only a few guards remained near the chamber's edges. Draven's gaze found his, something softening in his expression despite the weariness evident in his posture. "It does not feel like triumph," he admitted quietly. "Only relief that it is finally settled, and grief that someone I once trusted chose betrayal over loyalty." Cale understood that sentiment more than he expected to, having spent his own life navigating relationships built on obligation rather than genuine care. He said nothing further, simply remaining close as Draven gathered himself, the unspoken comfort of his presence apparently enough for both of them in that moment. Their reprieve, however, proved short-lived. Before the day had fully passed, a messenger arrived bearing word that Lord Ashford had grown tired of waiting for resolution through proper channels and had arrived at the palace himself, demanding an immediate audience to settle the matter of Cale's broken bonding contract once and for all. Draven's expression hardened at the news, though Cale noticed the way his hand found Cale's shoulder briefly, a small gesture of reassurance amid the fresh wave of anxiety building in Cale's chest. "Whatever happens in that audience," Draven said quietly, "know that I will not allow him to simply take you from this place." Cale nodded, though the fear coiling through him refused to fully settle, aware that unlike Silas's betrayal, which had been resolved through evidence and clear wrongdoing, Ashford's claim rested on a contract that, however unjust, still carried legal weight within the kingdom's traditions. Whatever battle awaited them in the throne room, it would not be won through evidence alone, but through Draven's willingness to challenge the very customs that had shaped Cale's entire life, until the moment he chose to run. As they made their way toward the throne room to face Ashford's arrival, Cale found himself steadying his breathing with quiet determination. He had run from this man once already, and though the fear of facing him again had not disappeared, something had changed since that desperate night on the battlefield. He was no longer running alone, and whatever happened next, he intended to face it with his head held high, rather than fleeing into another uncertain darkness. The throne room had transformed by the time they arrived, filled once more with nobles drawn by whispers of the unfolding drama, their curiosity now doubled after the morning's revelation regarding Silas Vance. Lord Ashford stood near the center of the chamber, flanked by two attendants carrying sealed documents, his posture radiating the same entitled confidence Cale remembered from every interaction throughout his childhood and youth. Ashford was older than Draven by perhaps 2 decades, his features sharp and calculating, dressed in fabrics clearly chosen to display wealth rather than practicality. When his gaze found Cale standing near the throne, something like triumph flickered across his expression, as though he had already decided the outcome of this confrontation, before a single word had been exchanged. "Your Majesty," Ashford said, bowing with just enough correctness to avoid outright disrespect while conveying his own sense of superiority. "I apologize for arriving without prior arrangement, but the matter I bring before you cannot wait for proper scheduling. This Omega," he continued, gesturing toward Cale with barely concealed disdain, "fled a lawful bonding arranged to settle a debt owed by his family. I demand his immediate return, along with appropriate compensation for the inconvenience his flight has caused." Draven's expression remained carefully neutral, though Cale could see the tension building beneath his composed exterior. "The debt you speak of," Draven said evenly, "was it not settled through the bonding contract itself, rather than requiring additional compensation beyond the Omega's compliance?" Ashford's jaw tightened slightly at the question, clearly not having anticipated the king questioning the specifics of the arrangement, rather than simply ruling on the matter of Cale's return. "The contract included provisions for compensation should the Omega prove difficult," he said carefully. "His flight has cost me both time and reputation, damages that deserve appropriate remedy." Cale listened to the exchange with rising anger, the familiar helplessness of being discussed as though he were nothing more than disputed property threatening to overwhelm the confidence he had tried to hold on to since entering the chamber. He forced himself to remain still, trusting Draven to navigate the political complexities of the confrontation, though every instinct screamed at him to speak for himself, rather than remain silent while his fate was debated. "Perhaps," Draven said, his tone carrying a subtle edge that made several nearby nobles shift uncomfortably. "We should examine more closely the nature of a contract that reduces a person's autonomy to settle a debt they had no part in creating. Cale was a child when this arrangement was first discussed, was he not?" Ashford's composure flickered, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "The specifics of the contract's origin are not relevant to its current legal standing," he said stiffly. "What matters is that it exists, properly signed and witnessed, and that the Omega in question broke its terms by fleeing." Cale could bear the silence no longer, stepping forward despite the way several nobles' eyebrows rose at an Omega speaking without invitation in such a formal setting. "I did not break terms I ever agreed to," he said, his voice steadier than he expected given how hard his heart was pounding. "I was a child, as His Majesty said, with no understanding of what was being decided for me. I fled the moment I was old enough to understand exactly what that contract demanded of my entire future, and I would flee again, given the same circumstances." A ripple of murmurs moved through the assembled nobles at Cale's words, some clearly scandalized by his boldness, others watching with something closer to sympathy. Ashford's face reddened with barely contained fury, though he seemed to recognize that direct anger toward Cale in front of the king and his court would only weaken his position further. "Your Majesty," Ashford said, forcing his voice back into something more measured, "whatever sympathy the Omega's youth may inspire, the law does not simply dissolve contracts because one party later regrets the terms. If such precedent were established, no bonding agreement in the kingdom would hold any weight whatsoever." Draven considered this argument carefully, and Cale could see him weighing the political complexity of the situation, aware that whatever ruling he made would ripple far beyond this single confrontation, potentially reshaping how bonding contracts were viewed throughout the entire kingdom. The silence stretched long enough that tension filled the chamber like a held breath. Finally Draven spoke, his voice carrying the weight of careful deliberation. "I will not rule hastily on a matter with such far-reaching implications," he said. "But I will say this clearly. Any contract that binds a person to obligations they had no voice in creating, particularly one signed on their behalf as a child, deserves far greater scrutiny than has traditionally been applied. I am calling for a formal review of the bonding laws as they currently stand, beginning with this specific contract as its first case." Ashford's expression twisted with barely contained outrage. "Your Majesty, surely you do not intend to overturn generations of established law based on a single Omega's flight." "I intend," Draven replied, his voice hardening with unmistakable authority, "to ensure that the laws of this kingdom serve justice, rather than simply convenience for those wealthy enough to arrange such contracts in the first place. Until the review is complete, Cale remains under my protection, and no further claims regarding this contract will be entertained." The finality in Draven's tone left no room for further argument, and Ashford, despite his obvious fury, seemed to recognize that pressing further in this moment would only damage his own standing before the assembled court. He bowed stiffly, his eyes finding Cale one last time, with a look that promised this confrontation was far from truly finished, before turning and departing the chamber with his attendants trailing behind him. Once Ashford had gone, the throne room slowly emptied of curious nobles, their whispered conversations trailing after them as they dispersed into the palace's many corridors. Cale remained near the throne, his legs suddenly weak now that the confrontation had passed, the adrenaline that had carried him through his bold words draining away and leaving exhaustion in its place. Draven descended from the throne to stand beside him, his expression softening from the hardened authority he had displayed moments before into something warmer and more personal. "You spoke well," he said quietly, braver than most nobles who have stood in that chamber facing far less at stake. "I was terrified," Cale admitted honestly, though something in Draven's steady presence made the confession feel safe rather than shameful. "Fear and courage are not opposites," Draven said, his voice gentle. "Sometimes courage is simply choosing to speak despite the fear rather than because it has disappeared." Cale studied Draven's face in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, aware of how much had shifted between them since that first terrifying moment, when the beast he hid inside had stirred awake. Whatever uncertainty remained about the future, about Ashford's lingering resentment, or the political complications the promised review of bonding laws would surely stir, Cale found himself unwilling to face any of it from anywhere other than exactly where he now stood. The weeks that followed brought a strange, fragile peace to the palace, though Cale understood better than most that peace built on unresolved grievances rarely lasted without challenge. Silas Vance's trial concluded swiftly, his betrayal too thoroughly documented to allow for any defense, and he was stripped of his title and holdings, sentenced to exile from the kingdom's borders under permanent watch. The council review of bonding laws proceeded more slowly, tangled in generations of tradition and the resistance of nobles who benefited greatly from arrangements similar to the one that had once bound Cale's fate to Ashford's whims. Cale settled into palace life with growing confidence, no longer merely surviving each day but beginning to find genuine purpose within it. He assisted with correspondence related to the bonding law review, his own experience lending weight to arguments that might otherwise have remained abstract to nobles who had never faced such circumstances themselves. Draven encouraged this involvement whenever his own duties allowed, and slowly, the palace staff who had once regarded Cale with curious suspicion began to treat him with genuine respect. The relationship between Cale and Draven deepened steadily during this period, moving beyond the careful boundaries either of them had initially maintained. Evenings often found them together, sometimes discussing matters of state, sometimes simply enjoying each other's company over quiet meals or walks through the palace gardens as autumn deepened into the first chill of winter. Neither had spoken openly of the feelings clearly growing between them, though the palace staff exchanged knowing smiles whenever the two were seen together, and even Edric had begun offering Cale a warmth that suggested full acceptance into Draven's inner circle. It was during one such evening walk through the gardens, frost beginning to touch the edges of the fountains, that Draven finally broke the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I received word today," he said carefully, "that Ashford has not abandoned his grievance, despite the setback of our confrontation weeks ago." Cale's chest tightened with familiar unease. "What has he done?" he asked, bracing himself for whatever news awaited. "He has petitioned several allied nobles, claiming that my ruling regarding your contract sets a dangerous precedent that threatens the stability of trade agreements throughout the kingdom," Draven explained. "He seeks to rally support for overturning the review before it concludes, arguing that established contracts, however they were originally created, must be honored to maintain order." Cale absorbed this news with a mixture of frustration and weary familiarity. Ashford had always been persistent, using whatever tools available to him to secure what he believed belonged to him by right. "Will he succeed?" Cale asked quietly. Draven's expression hardened with quiet determination. "Not while I hold this throne," he said firmly. "But I will not pretend the fight is finished. He has convinced several nobles that their own contracts and arrangements are threatened by the precedent this review might set. I expect he will push for a formal challenge before the full council within the coming weeks." The weight of that possibility settled heavily over Cale, threatening the fragile sense of safety he had built since arriving at the palace. He found himself reaching for Draven's hand without fully deciding to do so, needing the reassurance of solid contact amid the uncertainty stirring in his chest. Draven's fingers closed around his immediately, steady and warm despite the cold evening air. "Whatever he pushes for," Draven said quietly, "I will not allow him to undo what has already been decided. You are not returning to that man, regardless of what arguments he brings before the council." Cale studied Draven's face in the fading evening light, searching for any hesitation behind the certainty of his words, and finding none. "I do not know how to thank you," he said softly, "for everything you have done, everything you continue to risk, for someone who arrived in your life through nothing more than desperate chance." Draven's expression shifted into something gentler, his free hand rising to brush lightly against Cale's cheek. "It was not chance that kept you safe inside me during those 3 days," he said quietly, "nor chance that led you to speak such honest truths to what you believed was nothing more than a lifeless shell. Whatever brought you into my life, I no longer think of it as accident. I think of it as the beginning of something I did not know I was searching for until you were already here." The words settled between them with a quiet weight that finally broke through the careful boundaries both had maintained since their journey began. Cale's heart pounded as he searched Draven's face, understanding fully now what had been building between them for weeks without either of them naming it aloud. "I feel the same," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have felt it for longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself." Draven's expression softened further, something like relief flickering behind his golden eyes. "Then let Ashford bring whatever challenge he intends," he said, his voice steady with quiet resolve. "Whatever happens before the council, know that my feelings for you are not contingent on the outcome of any political battle. You matter to me, beyond whatever role you have played in exposing betrayal or challenging unjust law." Cale allowed himself, for the first time since fleeing his forced bonding, to imagine a future built not on obligation or survival, but on genuine choice and mutual affection. The thought filled him with a warmth that eased the anxiety Ashford's renewed threat had stirred, though he knew better than to believe the coming confrontation would be simple or without risk. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the arrival of a palace guard, breathless from hurrying through the gardens, bearing news that pulled both of them immediately back into the reality awaiting beyond their private conversation. "Your Majesty," the guard said, bowing quickly, "Lord Ashford has arrived at the palace once more, and he has brought several allied nobles with him. He requests an immediate audience, claiming urgent matters that cannot wait for the scheduled council session." Draven's grip on Cale's hand tightened briefly before releasing, his expression settling back into the composed authority Cale had come to recognize as the mask he wore when facing challenges to his rule. "It seems," he said grimly, "that Ashford intends to force this confrontation sooner than either of us expected." Cale squared his shoulders, drawing strength from the words Draven had just spoken, from the certainty that whatever affection had grown between them was not contingent on winning whatever battle awaited in the throne room. "Whatever happens," he said, echoing the resolve he saw reflected in Draven's own expression, "we will face it together." Draven's answering look carried a warmth that steadied Cale's racing heart, and together they turned to follow the guard back toward the palace, toward whatever confrontation Ashford had arrived to force, both aware that the outcome of this coming clash would determine far more than simply the fate of a single broken bonding contract. The throne room filled quickly once word spread that Ashford had returned with allied nobles in tow, curiosity and tension mingling in the air as courtiers gathered to witness whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Cale took his place near the throne, standing straighter than he had during their first encounter weeks earlier, no longer the frightened runaway who had once cowered before this man's authority. Ashford entered flanked by 4 nobles whose families held significant trade influence throughout the kingdom, each of them wearing expressions of carefully practiced concern, as though they had gathered out of genuine worry for the kingdom's stability, rather than self-interest in preserving contracts similar to the one binding Cale's fate. "Your Majesty," Ashford began, his tone dripping with false civility, "we come before you today representing grave concerns shared by many across this kingdom regarding the review you have initiated into bonding law." Draven, seated upon his throne with the easy authority of a man fully recovered from his injuries, regarded the assembled nobles with calm patience. "Speak your concerns," he said evenly, "though we both know this gathering serves your personal grievance far more than any genuine worry for the kingdom's stability." Ashford's composure flickered slightly at the directness of the response, though he pressed forward regardless. "The precedent you seek to establish, Your Majesty, threatens the very foundation of commerce and family alliance that has stabilized this kingdom for generations," he said. "If contracts can be dissolved simply because one party later regrets their terms, what assurance does any noble family have that their arrangements will be honored?" One of the allied nobles stepped forward to add his own voice to the argument, and for a moment, it seemed as though the momentum of the confrontation might shift against Draven's position. But before the noble could finish his statement, a commotion at the chamber's entrance drew everyone's attention, and Edric strode in, flanked by 2 guards escorting a nervous-looking man in modest clothing, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention directed his way. "Your Majesty," Edric announced, "forgive the interruption, but this man has information directly relevant to the matter currently before the court." Draven gestured for the man to be brought forward, and Cale watched with growing curiosity as the stranger, introduced as a clerk who had once served in Ashford's household, began recounting details of exactly how the original bonding contract binding Cale's family had been drafted. His testimony revealed that the debt supposedly owed by Cale's family had been deliberately inflated through manipulated accounts, engineered specifically to force a bonding arrangement that benefited Ashford far beyond any legitimate claim. The chamber fell into stunned silence, as the clerk's testimony painted a picture of calculated exploitation rather than legitimate debt, revealing that Ashford had manufactured the very obligation he now claimed the law must protect. Ashford's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence crumbling as murmurs of outrage rippled through the assembled nobles, several of whom exchanged uneasy glances with their allies who had come to support his cause. "This changes everything, Your Majesty," one of the allied nobles said quietly, clearly distancing himself from Ashford's position now that evidence of manipulation had come to light. "We did not come here to defend fraudulent contracts." Draven's gaze settled on Ashford with cold finality. "It seems," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber, "that the contract you have fought so hard to enforce was never legitimate to begin with, manufactured through deception to bind a person who owed you nothing beyond what your own greed invented." Ashford opened his mouth to protest, though no words emerged that could counter the damning testimony now laid bare before the entire court. His allies, one by one, stepped back from his side, unwilling to associate themselves further with a scheme so clearly built on fraud rather than legitimate grievance. "I hereby void the contract entirely," Draven declared, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. "And given the evidence of deliberate manipulation presented here today, I am ordering a full investigation into Lord Ashford's other dealings, to determine whether similar schemes have harmed other families within this kingdom." Ashford, recognizing the complete collapse of his position, made no further protest, his shoulders sagging with the weight of exposure as guards moved to escort him from the chamber pending further investigation. The nobles who had arrived alongside him dispersed quickly, eager to distance themselves from a scandal that threatened to taint anyone associated with it. Once the chamber had emptied of everyone but Draven's closest advisors and Cale himself, a profound stillness settled over the space, the weight of the confrontation finally lifting to reveal something like genuine relief beneath it. Draven descended from his throne, crossing the distance between them, and for a moment, neither spoke, simply absorbing the reality that the danger which had shadowed Cale's entire life had finally, truly ended. "It is over," Draven said softly, his hand finding Cale's with a gentleness that contrasted sharply against the authority he had commanded moments before. Cale felt tears he had not expected gathering in his eyes, the accumulated weight of years spent under the shadow of an unjust obligation finally lifting free. "I am free," he said, testing the words as though they might disappear if spoken too loudly. "You are," Draven confirmed, his voice warm with quiet affection. "Free to choose whatever future you wish, without contract or obligation shaping that choice for you." Cale studied Draven's face, understanding fully what the moment demanded, and what he genuinely wished for himself beyond the freedom he had just been granted. "And if I choose you," he asked quietly, "not from obligation, but because these past weeks have shown me something I never believed I would find, what then?" Draven's expression filled with a warmth that outshone any authority he carried as king, his hand rising to cup Cale's face gently. "Then I would consider myself the most fortunate ruler this kingdom has ever known," he said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "Not because a king has claimed an omega, but because two people who found each other through the strangest of circumstances have chosen, freely and without obligation, to build something lasting together." Cale closed the remaining distance between them, and for the first time since fleeing his forced bonding beneath a storming sky, he felt no fear in the choice he was making, only certainty. Whatever future awaited them, forged from the strange chance of a runaway omega hiding inside a fallen war beast, it belonged fully to both of them now, chosen freely, built on trust earned through danger and honesty rather than obligation and fear. Word of the reformed bonding laws spread quickly through the kingdom in the months that followed, bringing relief to countless families who had once felt trapped by arrangements similar to the one that had shaped Cale's early life. Draven's reign grew stronger for the compassion and justice he had shown, and Cale, no longer merely a companion hiding in the shadow of a king's protection, became a respected voice within the court, his own experiences shaping policy that protected others from the fate he had so narrowly escaped. Their bond, when it was finally formalized, was celebrated not as a political arrangement, but as a genuine partnership built on choice, understanding, and a connection neither of them had expected to find in the wreckage of a battlefield. And though the memory of those 3 desperate days hiding inside a fallen beast never fully faded from Cale's mind, he came to think of them not as the darkest days of his life, but as the strange, unlikely beginning of the greatest chapter of it.